join all of us in this great conversation.
First, I want to introduce my wife, Kathy, who actually wrote the book. She's always correcting me. I'm really glad to see all the students here. It's not that usual that this proportion of students come to these events, and I'm very appreciative of the two teachers that brought them here or made them come here for extra credit. Where are the teachers? Could you stand up, please? I was talking to them a few minutes ago and asking about the students, about you, some of you in the audience, and asking how relevant is what I have to say to your lives, just to make sure. Just as some background, the book that came before The Nature Principle is the book that is more well known, and that's called Last Child in the Woods. And the subtitle of that is Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. And that phrase, nature deficit disorder, began as kind of a tongue-in-cheek phrase. The publisher talked me into having it on the cover, and then it became part of the book. I went back in and structured the book around that idea. I resisted having that on the cover, which shows you what I know about marketing. But this phrase, which actually I believe that Kathy suggested at one point when I was talking about attention deficit disorder and the new research that was coming out and suggesting that just a little bit of contact with nature would lower the symptoms of attention deficit disorder. In any case, that phrase has entered the language. In fact, it's now entered several languages. The book has been translated, I think, into 13 or 14 languages so far. So it struck a chord, and I think the reason is that many of us knew that this huge disconnection between children and the natural world was happening, but we really didn't have a language to talk about it. And I started picking that up in interviews I was doing with families for a different book in the late 1980s. And I was beginning then. And parents were very uncomfortable. They didn't know quite why their kids didn't want to go outside very much anymore. They had no, as I say, words to describe that. And part of the reason for that is because this is unprecedented in human history. For all of human history and prehistory, kids went outside and spent most of their developing years either playing or working in the natural world. And within just about 3 decades, that has changed radically. I won't bore you with the statistics, but the gap between children and nature, the amount of time that they actually spend in nature, particularly unstructured time, has plummeted. And with that has plummeted visitations to the national parks. That seems to be on the rebound now after 15 or 20 years of dropping. But that has huge implications for psychological health, for physical health, for cognitive functioning, ability to learn, because we are still hunters and gatherers biologically. We've not changed biologically. If I could, actually it's not in this book, I was going to read you something from Last Child, so I won't. The people who have looked at this issue, oh, thank you. Always trust a bookseller. See, I borrowed this from her to read from, and she gave me a look, like I've got to return it. So let me share with you from Last Child, kind of it's about a page of copy. And it's the essence, I think, of why I think this is so important, and not only to children, but to all of us. If, when we were young, we tramped through forests of Nebraska cottonwoods, or raised pigeons on a rooftop in Queens, or fished for Ozark bluegills, or felt the swell of a wave that traveled 1,000 miles before lifting our boat, then we were bound to the natural world, and we remain so today. Nature still informs our years, lifts us, carries us. For children, nature comes in many forms: a newborn calf, a pet that lives and dies, the worn path through the woods, a fort nestled in stinging nettles, a damp, mysterious edge of a vacant lot. Whatever shape nature takes, it offers each child an older, larger world separate from parents. Unlike television, nature does not steal time, it amplifies it. Nature offers healing for a child living in a destructive family or neighborhood. It serves as a blank slate upon which a child draws and reinterprets the culture's fantasies. Nature inspires creativity in a child by demanding visualization and the full use of the senses. Given a chance, a child will bring the confusion of the world to the woods, wash it in the creek, turn it over to see what lives on the unseen side of that confusion. Nature can frighten a child too, and this fright serves a purpose. In nature, a child finds freedom, fantasy, and privacy, a place distant from the adult world, a separate peace. These are some of the utilitarian values of nature, but at a deeper level, nature gives itself to children for its own sake, not as a reflection of a culture. At this level, inexplicable nature provokes humility. In these books, I talk a lot about the human senses, and the most important human sense, I believe, is the sense of humility. Unless we are attached to nature, unless we come to know the animals around us, the plants around us, and know that we are not alone, and know that we cannot go it alone, and we do not have true humility. And with the arrogance of that comes many pathologies for our species. The research in the 1990s and in the beginning of the 2000s that began to come forth was the first time, in many ways, that child development people, the scientists who look at human development, had even looked at the impact of the natural world on children, on adults, on their health. There were a few pioneers before that, and there was a lot of common sense. But that common sense faded over the decades. At the beginning of the last century, 1900, 1920, 1880s, people knew that nature needed to be accounted for in the planning of cities. Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park, he didn't base that on a lot of scientific studies. He based that on what was assumed, on common knowledge, on practical common sense. The industrialists that asked him to design Central Park in New York, they weren't interested in studies, and they weren't interested in a pretty view. They wanted him to design and build Central Park because they knew that nature helped their workers be more productive. That's where many of the great urban parks came from, that idea. It wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about the connection of nature to human health and well-being and productivity. The research that's come out has shown many things. It has shown, as I say, the connection with children and attention deficit disorder, the symptoms of that. Just a walk through trees in an urban park in Chicago. These are kids in the projects of Chicago that University of Illinois has been studying. Just a walk through trees in an urban park and the symptoms of attention deficit disorder get better. This is an ongoing set of studies. And the people who have been doing those studies, Francis Kuo and others at the University of Illinois, they suggest that nature therapy be added to the other therapies, which are more traditional for attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, which include behavioral modification and Ritalin and other stimulants. Now I want to make clear that I'm not a radical on Ritalin. Some kids, I think, need some kind of medication. But what proportion of the huge increase in the number of kids that are being diagnosed with attention deficit disorder and then handed a stimulant like Ritalin, what proportion of that huge increase truly is because of some brain malfunction? And how much of it is because of something else? In some schools in the United States, 30% of the boys are on Ritalin. There's been a lot of concern about this recently. The New York Times has done a series on this. Pediatricians are very much questioning this, many of them. Many of them feel backed into prescribing this by parents and by teachers who suggest to the parents that their kid is acting out in school and needs Ritalin. The studies show that there is a dramatic improvement in kids' behavior when they get outside more. Not all children, but many of them. I can't tell you how many teachers have said, almost with the same exact words, this sentence: the troublemaker in class becomes the leader when I get the class outside into nature. Again and again, I hear that. In fact, where is she, Sylvia? Are you here too? You said the same thing last night. You've heard that yourself. What's that?
My husband Ron is in education. He's a school principal. He's worked for himself over the 30 years that he's been in schools.
Yeah. I hear that again and again. I hear it from parents too. I hear it from parents whose children have Asperger's or issues like that, and they say they started getting their kids outside and things got better. Now, I'm not saying that would replace the medications, but it certainly augments them. I often tell this story about being in a San Francisco hotel room and picking up the magazines that are in the hotel, you know, the ones that you wonder who put them there. And on the back page of this one magazine was this black and white photograph of a little boy on a beach. And he's running along the beach and his arms are out and his eyes are filled with life. And the story, and I think it was a California beach, the story about that little boy next to the photograph said that he had a problem. He had the wiggles. He couldn't sit still. He was disruptive in class. The school finally had enough and they kicked him out. The parents, of course, were upset about that. But they had already observed how their little boy was able to focus and calm himself more when he was outside in nature. For instance, on that beach. So for the next 10 years, they took their little boy all over the great wilderness areas of the West. Little boy turned out fine. The photograph was taken in 1906, and the little boy's name was Ansel Adams. So here's a couple questions. What would have happened if they'd taken little Ansel and they put him in a chair in a school that may not have any windows, as many schools were built in the 70s with no windows? What if they put him in that chair and they tested him all day and they told him to sit still and perhaps they canceled recess or cut back on recess or punished him when he misbehaved by taking away recess, which schools often do? What if they canceled the field trips, which many schools have done? Schools across this country have canceled or cut back on recess and field trips in order to keep that kid in this chair taking that test over and over and over again. And lengthening the school day. What if they'd done that for little Ansel? And lengthen the school year for little Ansel. And then put him on Ritalin. Would we have the great gifts that Ansel Adams gave us in those photographs? Would we have the political support, such as it is, for the national parks, if he had not given us those photographs? What would have happened to little Ansel without nature? The second question is, how many other little Ansels and Anselettes are out there right now who might give us great gifts in the future if we give them the gift of nature? Now, the studies have moved into cognitive functioning. Kids who play on a natural play space, with trees and bushes and real grass, maybe some native species. The kids who play in a natural play space have been compared to kids who play on a flat asphalt or turf play area. The kids in the natural play space are far, far more likely to invent their own games than the kids on a flat asphalt or turf play area. It stimulates creativity. Studies, an unpublished study done by the same people at the University of Illinois who did the research on attention deficit disorder. I hope it's published soon, but the authors have given me permission to tell you about it. First, I should say that most of the studies done in the last 15 years are correlated, they don't show a direct cause relationship. That's because nobody thought to ask the question 30 years ago, so we don't have the 30-year longitudinal studies. But this growing number of correlated studies all point in the same direction. And that's very unusual for a big body of correlated research to point in the same direction. So what the people at the University of Illinois have found out recently, they have done a 10-year longitudinal study of over 500 schools in Chicago and over 1.5 million tests. And what they found is that they've compared the schools that are green, and by that I don't mean solar panels. I mean actual greenery, actual school gardens, kids getting outside more, field trips that take them into nature, all of those types of things, more nature inside the school itself, compared to schools that were not green. They also compared schools that had not been green, but green themselves. And they factored out all of the factors that might throw this survey off. And what they found is that the greening of the school can accomplish as much or more than anything that has been tried to raise test scores in the No Child Left Behind era. They say it's a very cost-effective way of raising test scores. That has been forgotten by education. It's now being remembered by some schools. I know there's a great woman here who's really infiltrating a lot of the schools in Los Angeles and this area to make sure they have school gardens. That's beginning to catch on. But that idea that nature might have something to do with learning is an old idea. There's nothing new here. But it's coming back. It was forgotten, and now I believe it's coming back. In terms of physical health, and this is reported in the Nature Principle, studies of adults on treadmills and indoor gyms, comparing those adults to adults who spend the exact same number of calories but do it outside in nature, hiking, gardening, etc. These two groups, the people on the indoor treadmill and the indoor gym, they get healthier. Their blood pressure gets better, their psychological well-being improves. But the people who do this outside get even better. And we don't understand why that is, but there's this margin of improvement that's almost magical that the science does not understand. There's theories about this. The E.O. Wilson at Harvard came up with what he calls the biophilia hypothesis several decades ago. The biophilia hypothesis says that we are, as a species, hardwired to need nature, to have an affiliation with the natural world. Studies have been done of what images human beings are attracted to all over the world. Humans in very urban places that have never been outdoors, particularly in nature, people who live in jungles, people who live in Kansas and Africa, etc., And the images that human beings are attracted to more than any other images are images of the natural world. And of those images, of landscapes, the number one image that human beings are attracted to is the image of the savanna. Now, where did we come from? What are our genetic roots? That doesn't prove that there's this great genetic link to the past, but it certainly stimulates the conversation. This is in us. This is part of who we are. This is part of our humanity. And we've been cutting it off. We've been cutting it off for a couple generations. Another theory on this is the attention restoration theory by a couple of researchers named Kaplans. Their theory is that when we look at computers all day, or when we do paperwork all day, office work, we use a certain kind of attention. It's called directed attention. And that burns us out. That's the kind of, you've been on the computer all day and you just feel fried, right? That's because we've been paying too much directed attention for too long. They say the way to relieve the brain of that fatigue is to pay a different kind of attention, which they call fascination. And fascination happens when you're paying so much attention that you forget that you're paying attention. It's not an effort. It's the kind of attention, they say, that is best stimulated outdoors in nature. So if we feel burned out, if our students feel burned out, if we as adults feel burned out, the best thing we can do is go outdoors, into nature. The senses is kind of my theory, and it's not based on direct science, but it's just observation. What, other than a New York subway, when else do you pay as much attention to all that's around you as you are when you're out in nature? The scientists who study the human senses no longer talk about 5 senses. They talk conservatively about 10 senses, human senses. And some of the scientists talk about as many as 30 human senses. They all have names. There have been studies of soldiers in Afghanistan and in Iraq. The Army, the military has done these studies. They've wondered, why do some soldiers know that there's something down that alleyway, that they shouldn't go out down that alleyway? This is a military study of this. We used to talk about the 6th sense. What this probably is a cluster of senses that are all working at the same time. And they found that the soldiers who have that sense either grew up in tough urban neighborhoods or, more so, grew up in rural areas where they were outside a lot in nature. Their senses had been tuned. They had been tuned to understand what is around them. I often ask this question, which is, could it be that we're creating an environment for ourselves, but particularly for children, in our schools and at home, in which we and they are spending more and more time looking at screens, blocking out most of our senses, including the senses we don't even know we have? To me, that's the very definition of being less alive. What parent wants their child to be less alive? Who among us wants to be less alive? What teacher wants their students to be less alive? Well, maybe a few, but not most of them. To me, this is what it comes down to. Yes, there are huge health issues here. And study after study after study is showing that there's an impact on child obesity for people getting out. Not just outside doing soccer, but outside in nature. It seems to have a special set of properties. Study after study on myopia in Australia, studies on nearsightedness and the epidemic of nearsightedness show that there's a link to how much time the kids spend inside looking at screens, and that this gets much better when you get them outside into nature. Study after study on cognitive benefits, on psychological well-being. The urban parks with the greatest degree of biodiversity are the parks that have been shown to have the best impact on human psychological well-being. And I believe that that is because when we have urban parks, or some of the great natural areas that the Land Trust here has preserved, when we have that around us, we no longer feel alone. We need these other creatures. We need nature. We need to know that we are not the only ones. So it makes sense that we would feel psychologically better when we are surrounded by that. Now, what has been happening since Last Child came out, and then the nature principle is interesting. There are many people in this audience that have been working very, very hard to connect children to nature. There's a movement that has emerged. If you go to the Children in Nature Network, which is childreninnature.org, you'll see all kinds of good news. You'll see schools that have taken a different path finally. You'll see neighborhoods, cities. You'll see mayors that have made different decisions because they want to connect kids to nature. There are over 120 regional, state, provincial campaigns in North America now that are connecting kids to nature, that are big campaigns that are not just one organization, but pulling together networks of organizations. One of the first was in Cincinnati, and in the beginning they said, they called it Leave No Child Inside Cincinnati. And they thought about that for a while. And then they changed the name, they put a comma in there, I think. But these things have proliferated, and they're making a big difference. They're making a big difference. The current Secretary of Interior is the third Secretary of Interior that I've worked with that has dedicated herself, and the other two were men, to connecting kids to nature, to making this central to the Department of the Interior. The Obamas have paid some attention to this issue. There was a bill passed in the Congress, back when the Congress did things, a few years ago, called the No Child Left Inside bill, legislation. And it was passed to put more money into environmental education through the states, and then it stalled in the Senate. There's a lot going on around the country now. There's a lot more awareness of this. Pediatricians are beginning to pay attention. In 2010, I was asked to give the keynote address to the American Academy of Pediatrics, their national conference. And it was in San Francisco, and there were about 5,000 pediatricians and pediatric nurse practitioners and others in the audience. And and this was a big deal, if there's anybody who can talk to parents and be trusted by parents, it's pediatricians. So I was pretty nervous about it. So Kathy, who has left, she hates listening to my speech. Actually, she has to meet somebody down there. Kathy took my face, she's a nurse practitioner, and she took my face in her hands and she said, "Listen to me, Rich. Pediatricians are different from other doctors. They're really, really nice people." Yeah, other doctors are nice too. But that's it. And so I led with that, with the pediatricians, and they liked that, of course. And so I was off to a good start. I was worried about the response. The response was incredible. It was wonderful. It was great. And since then, many pediatricians are beginning to literally prescribe nature. There's a pediatrician named Robert Czar in Washington, D.C., who he and others have studied all the parks, the urban parks of Washington, D.C., and they made a database. And they're convincing other pediatricians to prescribe nature to their patients, but to actually tell them what the best part of your home is to go do it. They're in Portland, Oregon. The urban park district there partnered with the pediatricians and other physicians of Portland, Oregon, who began to write prescriptions or recommendations to their patients to go outside. The patients get home, the phone rings, and it's the park district, the urban park district, saying, "Here's what we can do for you." and come down to the park on Saturday and we'll help you get your green exercise. And they do. And the park rangers, now acting as park health paraprofessionals, a role they really like, help these families get their green exercise, sign off on the prescription, send it back, and over time they're going to study this, the effects. And I suspect the effects will be good. So this is happening around the country. It's happening around the world too. I spend more and more time in places like Australia. Next month, my wife and I are going to New Zealand. A lot of things are happening and were happening before in Scandinavia. This is something that we all sense we need to do. The barriers are significant. The barriers to parents and to kids for encouraging kids to go outdoors cannot be underestimated. Despite this good news, we have to keep in mind that the whole world is moving into cities. The whole world is urbanizing. That's not going to slow down. In 2008, more people in the world lived in cities for the first time in human history than in the countryside. That's the first time in human history. That's a huge moment in human history. That means one of two things. Either human beings are going to continue to lose whatever connection they have to the natural world, or it means the beginning of a new kind of city. I like door number 2. I like the idea of thinking about nature-rich cities, a new kind of city. But these barriers, some of them are coming down slowly, but some of them are growing. Parents are scared to death to let their kids go outside, many of them. This is one of the biggest ones, is fear of strangers, which translates often into fear of nature itself. The more we withdraw from nature, the more we fear it. The fear of strangers is so intense that the distance that kids can go from their own home, there have been studies that have shown the circumference around one's home is becoming closer and closer and closer, and now it's the front stoop if the parents let them even go sit outside in their own yard. There's a worry about that. I never dismiss the fear that people feel. I never make fun of it. And there's some authors out there that are doing that. I don't do that because I understand that fear. Because Kathy and I had that when we were raising our boys too. Even though I knew better because I reported on the real statistics. The real statistics are that violent crime toward children outside the home has been going down for at least 30 years. There are relatively few stranger abductions, about 150 per year in the United States. Now, 1 is too many, 150 is certainly too many, but it's nowhere near the thousands that people believe it is. And that's because I was a journalist for a long time. I'm not sure what I am now, but that's because of my profession, in part. All you have to do is watch CNN or Fox, and you'll see how they take a handful of crimes against children, and they repeat those crimes over and over and over again. And then when they're done telling them about the crime, they tell you about the trial over and over and over again. That's the very definition of conditioning. We're being conditioned to live in a state of fear. Some people think this is some kind of media conspiracy. I don't, because that would attribute too much institutional intelligence to my profession. But it has the effect of conspiracy. That fear is palpable. That fear is not going to go away because the media are not going to change anytime soon. So increasingly, we have to figure out new ways to connect with nature, and I'll speak to that a little bit later. Another barrier, obviously, is electronics. Now, I'm not anti-tech. I have an iPhone right here. I'm speaking in a microphone. It's tough to be anti-tech when you're speaking into a microphone. Not anti-tech, but there's a mantra that goes throughout the nature principle, which is that the more high-tech our lives become, the more nature we need. Remember those studies of the attention is how we pay attention, directed attention to the burnout, that we need nature to balance that. The more high-tech our lives become, the more nature we need. That's not being against technology, that's being for nature. That's being for balance, and we are out of balance. One thing I'd like to say before I end is about the future of education. The people who are determining the future of education right now, the debate about education is one that most of us have not been invited to. I'm not talking about the core, what's it called? Common Core. I'm not talking about Common Core because I'm rather an agnostic about Common Core. What's more important than the Common Core is the plans for how that will be executed. The people in charge of that debate know exactly what kind of classroom they want in the future, what kind of school they want, and it has nothing to do with going outside. It has nothing to do with experiential learning. It has everything to do with more computers in the schools, even more than there are now, more video games as teaching tools in the schools, literally. And they speak without a lot of embarrassment about what they call self-monitoring. Self-monitoring is using the technologies that are now used in grocery stores to track inventory, but doing it in the classroom so that the good news is that testing as we know it will fade away. The strange news, at least to me, is that we won't need it anymore because the machines will be watching our kids all the time. Every keystroke they do will be measured. Now, I'm not saying that technology in the schools is a bad thing. It's not going to go away. It's important. It has great attributes. But where is the sense of balance? The huge economic force of technology now has no counterweight to it economically in the debates with school boards and so forth. Who is out there? What economic force is out there that can stand up to that? I think the only force that can stand up to it is this Children and Nature movement, this new nature movement, a greater awareness of the importance of balance, the greater awareness of the importance of time spent in nature to the ability to learn, to be whole, to be healthy. I'm going to end right here because I feel like I'm droning a little bit. And I'm going to ask you to say some things and ask questions. Yes, sir.
Sure. Everything you told me today, you should take the heart. I'm over 93.
You're 93?